Hi guys, it's Kirsty. Today's video focuses on moral scrupulosity. So you may have heard the word scrupulosity in regards to OCD obsessions surrounding religion. This isn't a video about religious OCD. It's not something that I have experienced before. So I'm not really kind of in a position too much to talk about that, but I would like to discuss moral scrupulosity, which is kind of an excessive focus on whether we're kind of thinking or behaving in a moral way. But before I go into that, I would like to ask, please do subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button below in order to stay up to date with new videos as they're released. So in order to describe moral scrupulosity correctly, I am going to make reference to something online where I was looking up kind of good descriptions of it, so I could make sure I'm clear enough here. So unlike religious scrupulosity, moral scrupulosity presents itself differently, whereby an individual experiences intrusive and negatively biased thoughts surrounding their moral character, typically involving unrealistic evaluations of themselves as bad or immoral based upon internalized judgments of their thoughts and actions. An individual's moral obsessions are commonly followed by a series of compulsive or avoidant behaviours in their attempt to reduce the distress that they're feeling and prevent their distorted fears from coming true or being exposed to others. So I felt like this would be a worthwhile video to make, firstly because I've kind of discovered more and more as I've heard about moral scrupulosity. It's something that I've definitely suffered from at different points in my life, and it's something that kind of followed me around when my OCD was particularly bad about other things outside of my main obsession at the time, but I guess I didn't really realise that that's potentially what it was. But I would get hung up on things that other people wouldn't necessarily get hung up on and find myself ruminating, chewing the fat, kind of going over it and Googling. I also think that it's worth discussing this because I feel that moral scrupulosity can kind of seep into other themes as well. It's like what we say with other themes. Quite often the fear that fuels the theme is quite similar, or it's the same fear that's fueling several themes. So the reason I say this is because each of us as individuals have our own kind of sets of morals, regardless of whether we were brought up in a particularly strict way. I mean, I wasn't brought up in a particularly strict way. I was lucky enough to grow up with very kind parents. And I think that was maybe that's part of why I've placed such a huge kind of focus on kindness myself. So I would find myself overly obsessing about whether I've been kind enough to somebody in a conversation, or if I've come across rude, or if I've had perhaps a conflict with friends and they said or did something that made me feel uncomfortable and I've brought it up. I found myself going over it over and over and over again afterwards, kind of trying to work out if my behaviour in response to it was right or wrong, kind of needing to sort of feeling like I needed to know for definite if I reacted correctly and appropriately. And I would find myself not only ruminating about it, and I would like to point out here that I would have maybe experienced this, maybe a year into my OCD recovery as well. So at a point where I knew quite a good amount about OCD and particularly ROCD, which had been my main theme at the time, yet I still found myself getting sucked into kind of questioning my own morality when it came to my relationships, and going back to Googling and excessively talking to my partner about sort of maybe any conflicts I've had with friends or family excessively, which in fact is kind of it's reassurance seeking in a way, almost kind of confessing. And I found myself getting sucked into it, doing that, not realizing that actually my OCD was at play, driven by certain fears that were kind of fueling my inability to accept the fact that maybe I didn't react ideally to that situation, or maybe I wasn't kind enough, or maybe I was a bit rude, or maybe I was unfair, or maybe I was a bit dismissive. I was obviously at the time struggling to accept that uncertainty, so there were fears there fueling those behaviours. But the key thing that I do want to mention here is that it would be sort of, for me, in terms of my reactions, you know, to things that were happening in my friendships and family. So I feel like perhaps there's some crossover there with relationship OCD, which is where I kind of, you know, that's part of the reason I think this video is important to mention, that moral scrupulosity, you know, I think there's the fears can fuel other themes as well. And there are certainly crossovers too, which is why it's important to look at the core fear, and not, you know, obviously the theme is very important because the theme leads you to your core fear. But once you're starting to really wanting to, you know, looking at exposures or wanting to really dispute irrational beliefs, it's surrounding the core fear of the worst case scenario. So for me, looking at where my sort of, if we want to call it moral scrupulosity, focused around being kind enough and considerate enough to my friends and family, which in a way kind of crosses over a little bit with relationship OCD. I think, you know, for me, sort of driven by a fear of like losing people that I care about. But of course, there's also the fact that, you know, somebody suffering from relationship OCD may have fears of, you know, I don't want to be doing the wrong thing by staying with my partner, even though I'm having thoughts that I might not love them, i.e. it's morally wrong to, you know, lead them on or something. There's actions that you feel like you're taking with ROCD where you feel like you're going against your morals, in that you think it's not okay to stay with somebody when you're having them thoughts. So that's an example of where it can kind of cross over with other themes, maybe less obviously. Of course, more obviously would be you know, POCD or harm OCD, because it's generally not considered to be a moral thing to harm other people physically. But like I say, the less obvious ways is, you know, perhaps ROCD. I suppose in some ways that, you know, moral scrupulosity could also come into, if you're having obsessions about real events as well, or false events, false memories. It's all kind of thinking, did I act in an immoral way? Particularly, you know, with real event, it's kind of, you might be hung up on this thing that happened in the past, and did you behave really badly in that thing, and, you know, did you react badly? So, you know, there are definite crossovers here, but the main thing to talk about is that whether or not, you know, whether it crosses over with another theme, the fear that's driving it is kind of the important thing. But also it's the self-rating that's an issue with moral scrupulosity. It's the all or nothing thinking, the black and white, saying, you know, thinking that the distortion would be, you know, I'm thinking I didn't behave correctly in that situation. So that, you know, that kind of, that sums up me as an entirety. So I'm immoral, I'm bad, I have bad morals. When of course, even if you did, you know, you were inconsiderate on occasion, even if you are someone who values kindness and other people's feelings, perhaps if you even were inconsiderate on that occasion, it doesn't sum up your whole being. People aren't either good or bad. People are just people who are capable of both good and bad acts, and that involves acts that are kind of against, you know, acts that are both kind and unkind, and, you know, thoughts that are kind and unkind, and words that are kind and unkind. We're all capable of both sides and everything in between on the spectrum of nice and not nice. So it's, you know, that's a big part of it, which is, you know, a distortion which is at play with a lot of OCD themes, is the overall self-rating of good and bad. And when we can start loosening up our beliefs about that, it allows for a lot more kind of psychological freedom and flexibility there, in terms of maybe we don't have to get quite so hung up on that interaction or that particular thing that we thought, what if I did act in an immoral way in that moment. You know, it doesn't mean that the next time you won't act in a better way, and you can't have the intention of aiming to act in a better way going forward. And so along with that awful, another distortion there would be the awfulizing aspect of it. You know, it's awful that I treated that person that way. I'm just a complete and utter idiot. You know, I'm horrible. I'm immoral. For if I was unkind to that person. And again, it's that, is it really so awful? You know, is that person going to remember it in 5 years' time? Is that really the worst thing that you could have done with that person? And the same with having thoughts that you feel go against your morality as well. You know, it's kind of, you know, you're a person who has both good and bad thoughts. I mean, I won't go into that too much, because we're all sick to death of hearing thoughts, aren't we? So I won't go into that too much. But again, it's kind of like, we don't have to look at it in such a black and white way, and we don't have to label ourselves as 100% one way or another. So I just want to kind of have a little look at some of the compulsions that we may see with moral scrupulosity. So I've mentioned some of the ones that I've experienced myself. So, you know, naturally excessive rumination, it's what most of us do best. Googling, you know, how to know if you upset a friend, or how to know if you've behaved in an unkind way, perhaps. Or it might be like confessing to somebody else about that you've treated somebody a certain way. You've had a thought about somebody, and it's, you know, an unkind thought about them. Or it might be excessively going over a situation, you know, whether that's a conflict that you've had with somebody. You know, excessively talking about it and trying to get to the bottom of whether you were in fact in the right or wrong, or whether your actions were justified or not. Or it might be checking in with somebody perhaps who you have had an interaction that you're unsure with about, you know, did I upset you? Or it might be perhaps going back on you, so I'm really sorry for saying it, any of that, I didn't mean to upset you. You know, it might be, even if you or simply just stood your ground with something, you might go back and kind of try and undo anything that you might have done. All of these things, trying to eliminate any uncertainty that you like of the possibility that you may have acted in a way that goes against, you know, your morals of right or wrong, or being kind. Another thing that we might find ourselves doing is, you know, avoidance behaviours. So we may try to avoid confrontation with people because we're afraid that we might not handle it correctly, and we don't want to be then plagued with the obsessions afterwards about whether or not we handled it correctly. You know, people might avoid social situations for fear that they might say something unkind or hurt someone's feelings. It might be, you know, avoiding making a complaint in a shop or restaurant if we haven't received good service, or sending or returning an item of clothing, or returning food that's not right, again for fear that, is this the correct way to behave, does it make me awful? You know, essentially it's kind of, does this make me, if it brings up obsessions that make you sort of start to question the kind of person that you are, and, you know, whether you're actually kind and polite, or actually you're changing into something that you really hate and you don't want to be. So as I've said, there's, you know, it helps if we want to try to get underneath some of this, it helps to identify what the core fears are. So one of the core fears is, you know, it's kind of like causing harm to somebody, maybe not physical harm, but perhaps causing emotional harm to somebody, you know, and then if you track it back, you know, what's the worst thing that can happen? You know, how bad can you make them feel? Or is it that you fear that you'll make somebody feel so bad that they commit suicide or something? So you want to start challenging, you know, challenging the worst case scenario here. Or it may be that you're afraid of, you know, ruining all of your relationships in your life. So, you know, so you're afraid that you're going to be alone. And if you don't, you know, always act correctly, you know, and kindly, and, you know, if ever you don't act kindly, it has to be that that was the right thing to do, because maybe, you know, that person, we have to know for definite that person we maybe weren't kind to didn't warrant us being kind to them because they behaved badly or something like that. So that it's kind of might be avoiding conflict in our relationships for fear that we will sabotage our relationships by behaving kind of badly. So it may be that, or it may be a fear of how other people will perceive us as a person, you know, that they will misunderstand us and think that we're horrible, or just or think that we're an immoral person, that they'll judge all of our, you know, values and morals based on that one thing, when in fact, obviously, you know, as I've said in other videos, one thing my mum used to say to me is that nobody thinks about you as much as you think about you, and that's so true. That person is probably not 100% likely to be ruminating over us about, oh, that person has terrible morals based on that one act, you know, based on that one thing that they said. It's kind of, we want to get past needing their approval. Okay, maybe they don't approve of us. Maybe they don't agree with, you know, the way we behave, and maybe they will judge us by that one thing that we may have done, behaved immorally. Also, another way we want to challenge this is that, you know, with morality looks different for every person. And it changes over time. It's the same as perspective. So what you know, the things that I might see as, you know, right or wrong, and the way I grew up, and, you know, what I've learned from my parents, and then what I've experienced in my life will be different to you, and will be different to your partner. And, you know, there'll be lots of things that line up, but it might not always look exactly the same as well. So if we're worrying about what other people may think of us, about our morals, a good thing to remember is that theirs will be different to ours anyway. So even if we, you know, torture ourselves or get stuck on the idea that we've behaved against our own moral system towards that other person might even see it differently anyway. So this is something else to kind of, if we can start really challenging how, you know, how tightly we have to hold on to these things, because if we clutch to it for dear life, thinking it will be awful if we don't act in line with these ways, you know, these beliefs, these morals that we have, thinking we're terrible if we don't, you know, we're terrible, it would be awful if we don't always act perfectly in line with those kind of ridiculously perfectionistic high standards that we set for ourselves, for our behaviour, that it's awful, when in fact to another person they haven't even noticed, it hasn't maybe occurred to them that you've acted in that way, because what they believe is kind of good, respectable behaviour, it might be different to yours. So I think it's really useful to bear that in mind. So I hope this video has been useful in discussing moral scrupulosity, how it can cross over with some other themes, but how it's it's driven by certain core fears that we might be holding on to. And I've obviously discussed how it can look in terms of compulsions. There are obviously many other compulsions. It looks different from person to person, but truly the way I see it is kind of a form of maybe perfectionism in terms of our behaviour, that we must behave perfectly at all times. But what is useful to acknowledge is that our idea of perfect is not the same as the next person's idea of perfect anyway. So it's really, really not helpful to us to hold on to that idea of that perfection so tightly, but also to examine, you know, how far, you know, how is that really helping me holding on to that? You know, all it's doing is meaning that I'm avoiding these situations. Maybe I don't always get what I want out of situations because I'm afraid, because I think I have to act, you know, I mustn't ask for what I want, or I mustn't ever make somebody else feel uncomfortable, you know. So we, you know, it's good to consider, you might be missing out on some really good stuff simply because you don't want to, you think it would be against your morals, or even that you don't want to have to then question it afterwards and be plagued by the uncertainty. So yes, I hope it's been helpful for you if you're somebody who maybe gets hung up on whether you've acted in an ideal way in certain things, and not in reference to specifically causing perhaps physical harm. So I hope it's been useful, and take care. Bye.